Philosophy Battle, the most entertaining presentation of philosophy you'll ever find on the internet, probably. Now entering the battlefield of metaphysics. Hey everyone, my name is AJ and welcome to Philosophy Battle. Before this video starts, I want to make clear this video will introduce ontology, what it is and to what degree it can be relative. It is after all important to investigate because it matters if there are actual legitimate grounds as to why someone might say we live in different worlds, so you can't support or criticize one another. Like, how exactly do we live in different worlds? And how extreme can that claim actually be meant? But it will actually lead us into an exciting discussion about realism and anti-realism in philosophy. Trust me, it's gonna be awesome. It's one of my favorite things to talk about in philosophy, so I may be a little bit theatrical at times. We will be discussing pre- and post-Kantian views, and well, it can be treacherous grounds, so if you don't get certain parts or get lost or don't know what's going on, don't worry about it too much. Just be patient, as it could very well be cleared up later, and the point at the end will be made pretty clear, at least I think so. The video is generally covering the discussion as it is presented in a book of a philosopher, Paul O'Grady, a pretty recent work, because I felt his book has a lot of great and interesting battles in it, as well as some important lessons for us. Now, I may end up saying this again a little bit later after I do a sort of recap into the video, so forgive me if this is repeated, but if you don't care about O'Grady or the larger discussion of relativism I'm having here, that's okay. You don't have to watch anything else if you don't want to, even if I'm suggesting another video in this video. Just take it more as a signpost, even an important signpost possibly if you want more information if I suggest other videos at various points, which I will. I believe this will be a good video regardless for introducing one of the main problems in metaphysics about ontology, or even in philosophy itself. So let's start the video. Ontological relativism. What is it, and why are we talking about it? Well, ontology is a field of study under the branch of philosophy called metaphysics. So we're doing philosophy and we're having a metaphysical discussion. A discussion about what though? Ontology is a discussion about what there is, what kind of things exist in the world, and what the world is fundamentally made of, or what kind of properties are a part of the world. So for example, believing there is only matter in the world, that the world is just made up of matter only, that's your ontological position. Or if you think the world is made up of ideas, which includes the senses, like the sense of touch and the sense of color, the sense of smells and so on. All of these just being ideas coming to your mind, and so the world is just that. The world is just made up of ideas and maybe minds that give and receive ideas. That would be an idealist ontology. Or even if your view of the world is that there's earth and there's heaven and hell, that too is your ontological position. A position about what there is in the world, what exists. Though that has some religious connotations, and we're not discussing religious views here. This is not about religion. We're just having a discussion about what there is in the world. And this conception seems to have a view that the world has different planes of existence. Perhaps for someone it's not about heaven and earth, but about universal forms and particular manifestations of that. All of these fit within the field of ontology. So perhaps in some sense, if we can just crudely say epistemology is about knowledge, then ontology would be about the world, or reality. And while people may have different views about what the world is fundamentally made of, or what kind of structure reality really has, our question today is about whether the world, or reality, is relative. Now, we commonly already are relativists about a number of things, not just things like taste in music or preference in Pokemon, but even in descriptions of physical things, like things being big. Such descriptions are known to be relative. The bird is big compared to the ant, but compared to the tree, it's not. The tree is actually big compared to the bird, but compared to the mountain, it's not. The mountain is actually big compared to the tree, and so on. Big is a relative description. In fact, if you imagine this self-illuminated cube were the only thing in the universe, nothing else, not even the edges of the screen as you look at it, then there's no way of knowing if it's big or small. Without anything to compare it to, calling it big is meaningless, an empty idea, and so there's no point here in talking about it like it could even be considered big. So what if the world, reality itself, is relative? What if our ontology is relative? Wait, relative to what? Well, guess what? We actually came here to the battlefield of metaphysics just to discuss the power and limits of this philosophic weapon called relativism. Why? Because we actually came from the battlefield of the philosophy of science, where we had encountered some enemies wielding this weapon to extreme degrees. So because of that, I thought it would be beneficial to come here to the battlefield of metaphysics just to dismantle this weapon, to show its power and limits. So while there are a few books I may cover, currently I'm covering this topic mostly based on the writings of philosopher Paul O'Grady in this green book called Relativism. In his book, he covers a variety of different philosophic areas to discuss relativism. He's not going to be discussing ethics or morals, what's right and wrong, or aesthetics, like what counts as beautiful. But he's more interested in cognitive things like truth and reality and knowledge, if even those things can be considered relative. So after explaining the power of relativism, which is a wickedly powerful weapon, he then goes on to defend against relativization in two areas. He battles against relativization on truth and on rationality. So I made a video covering his first chapter that I phrase as covering the power of relativism. That's my phrasing though. And I would really insist that you watch that video, especially before thinking that one can just offhand dismiss this enemy. If you think it's obvious or evident that relativism is wrong for any reason, I put a lot of work into this video and I think you should definitely check it out because it will definitely pay for any good philosopher who wants to conceptually grip what the issue really is in order to understand the power of this weapon. Not just in the sense to be able to dismantle our enemy to point out the flaws in their strategy, but also as a weapon to be wielded by us ourselves in order to challenge anywhere that there are baseless assumptions of objectivity or naive thoughts about what's obvious and evident. On the other hand, this weapon does have limits that our enemies did not appear to be aware of. The dangers of thinking everything is relative. So we already covered the great and totally awesome battle where Paul O'Grady defended truth against relativism, and please go check out that video. It's definitely one of my favorite battles of all time and certainly has important lessons that can go along with us in our philosophic journey forever, probably, I don't know. But he did also use a kind of principle of logic in order to make that defense. And so it kind of made sense that in that first chapter he did also talk about whether logic itself can be relative. So I guess I also therefore thought important to cover that topic and made a video discussing logic itself. Logic in the way that philosophers or logicians or kind of I guess also mathematicians know it. This is looking at formal symbolic logic and really offers a much more in-depth understanding of what logic is than the common person or lay person does. It certainly goes beyond the mere rhetoric of political pundits online, for example. There, however, Paul O'Grady did actually allow relativism, that we did seem to accept relativism in logic, but only in terms of a lower order, that there seemed to be a higher order and a lower one, and in the higher order there still seems to have maintained certain principles of logic, of which hasn't truly been argued for yet. It will be argued for in that chapter 5, the next battle. So I wanted to skip to that rationality battle, because I only came here to the battlefield of metaphysics to discuss the power and limits of this weapon. Having already covered the power, I only wanted to cover the limits, the places where he defends clearly against relativization. But I kind of noticed that in that area of rationality, Paul O'Grady does seem to have certain strategies and techniques that make reference to these previous chapters. So it would leave something wanting if I didn't at least somehow explain what's going on in these other areas. So I thought it important to at least kind of cover what's happening over here, since it is part of his strategy in rationality. But this video is gonna be way different from what I normally do. You see, normally I cite everything I say down to the line when I'm covering some philosopher's writing. But today, I'm not really going to be covering Paul O'Grady that closely. I'm just gonna give a more general description of what's going on in ontology in some way. So it's going to be much less structured and less scripted, since there's not much citation that I'm going to be giving anymore. You see, that kind of line-to-line citation that I was giving before actually provided some kind of order and script. Even though I don't ever use a kind of proper script, the kind of citation was still giving me a kind of order for my videos. But without it, this is much less scripted than my normal videos, so forgive me for that. But nevertheless, I will still try to present sort of what his framing of the main battles and the main issues are in this chapter as he presents it, kind of. Though I will still be clear about certain things that are framed in his way versus things that are framed from me. I'm just not actually going to be covering either of these chapters, like fully or in depth, as I did the other battles, where the battles are happening that I'm interested in. In any case, I will come back to talk about this chapter maybe later when I kind of finish off doing Paul O'Grady and want to give a full evaluation of this book. There's a reason why this chapter in particular is something that I might want to talk to in more depth or detail in the future. And I'll talk about what that reason is. In any case, the point of this video is just to generally cover ontological relativism and the kind of issues that are happening here, the sort of battles that are going on, in the more modern type of take, both as O'Grady frames it and as I would. And then we'll just discuss where O'Grady lands on this issue going forward. So if you don't know who O'Grady is or anyone else, don't worry about it. If you're here just to talk about ontological relativism, this video will still be very helpful, at least giving a kind of outlay of the kind of battle that's going on and the different issues and different perspectives that come to conflict with each other. Okay, let's go. As already discussed in the Power of Relativism episode, O'Grady points out a pre- and post-Kantian view. And don't let those words be spooky, I'll explain them. Basically, back in the pre-Kantian, before Kant, days, there was this kind of image. The idea that there was the world and us, or our mind. And we have beliefs and propositions or observations about the world as it is. So ontology was about that. The world that would be a certain way, even if we aren't there with our observations, beliefs, or thoughts. So, like, the tree is here, not there. The mountain is denser than the clouds, etc., etc. That the world, independent of our minds, is a certain way. The world that would be that way even if no humans existed. Even if all species capable of having beliefs and observations had gone extinct, the world in of itself, not relative to someone's perspective, would be there and be a certain way. So that's more of a pre-Kantian kind of picture. And while we can all have different kind of ontological beliefs about what that world is like, there still seemed to be some agreement pre-Kant that that's what we were talking about. But then Kant came along and he done messed that whole thing up. He changed the game for real. And now we have this new picture, where this world that we observe, that we have beliefs about or thoughts of and make propositions about, is actually constructed in part by our minds. The mind, by our categories of understanding, as Kant called them, needs to give shape to whatever it is that's out there to make a world that is even understandable by us. In this sense, we never directly observe reality itself. We can never really know in any which way or form what this outside stuff is, or anything about it, even possibly that it exists. So I represent it as this gray mush, but really I can't say it's gray, or say that it's mush. I can't really say anything at all. But I'm using this as a visual just to show that the concepts of color or shape that would come from us and our minds have not applied here. In fact, Robert Kirk calls this cosmic porridge. And this is not that I or Kirk are advocating that this is what reality really is. In fact, Kirk argues against this cosmic porridge kind of picture. Because as a realist, we want there to be something. and that this something is a certain way, not that it's merely some indistinct gray mush. Anyway, we'll get back to that. You see, Kant had these universal categories that everyone's mind has that structures the world as it is to us, as it must be to us. That ontology wasn't about the world independent of the mind, but the world as it is known by us, as it is observed by us. For example, when it comes to the understanding of bodies actually existing in our world, we have this kind of structure of understanding that a body must have extension in the 3 dimensions. And if it really is existing, perhaps extension within the 4th dimension of time as well. Or perhaps we can think of it kind of like as a net that applied from our mind results in producing the kind of things that we have contact with. Now, those are different kind of takes about what's going on, but in general, this is a Post Kantian picture. However, to have a better understanding about how it is that our concepts or the structure of our mind is actually structuring the world as we observe it, as we make sense of it or understand or think about it, please check out that Power of Relativism video. It will give a much more detailed discussion about how the mind is, in some sense, constructing. And if perhaps you are just more specifically concerned about science, you can maybe check out my video on the philosopher and historian of science Thomas Kuhn. One video is his response to his predecessor Karl Popper, and the other one is a video I made to explain how Kuhn's philosophy opened the gates to those who wanted to bring this weapon and make charges of relativism against even science. So if you're kind of more interested in that sort of construction and the kind of relativization of even observation, you can go check out those videos. However, while we're here in ontology though, let's continue with our discussion. In this case, the world that we can know, speak of, or observe is only one that can exist within the framework of our conceptual scheme, or categories, or paradigm, or any other name used to describe how it is that our mind is constructing the meaning of the world as we observe it. We have no access to this outside stuff. And because of this, depending on who you ask, not only does it make no sense to talk about whatever the outside is, it doesn't even make sense to say it exists. And I know that sounds kind of strange. But because they are not holding on to or even actively denying the idea of a mind-independent reality, they are considered anti-realists. And they are opposed by those who hold on to the existence of a mind-independent reality, who are considered realists. And this is a battle that is near and dear to my heart. Anyway, we should note that because Kant held, according to him, a more universal account of the categories, that is, the kind of conceptual structure that structures and gives meaning to the world as we observe or understand it, he nevertheless wasn't a relativist in that sense. However, because other philosophers such as C.I. Lewis, and I would argue also resources from natural science, would hold that these categories that we have, or concepts and conceptual schemes that we use in making the sense of the world as we know it, are also a product of a social, historical, and cultural background, meaning they could actually be different for different people. Different people in different times in different cultures have very different concepts, and the world as it is relative to those different sets of concepts would be different. Our ontology, what the world in this sense is therefore relative. This is ontological relativism, under that previous sense of anti-realism. Again, so we're clear, relativism here is that because people can have different concepts and different conceptual schemes, the world is different for everyone with a different conceptual scheme. And also importantly, that these different worlds, perhaps not in small part because they are anti-realists, cannot be reduced to each other, or that there is one correct world type of thing. That is the ontological relativist position. They cannot be reduced, and one is not more correct. Since certainly, at least according to their conception, there isn't exactly a mind-independent reality in order to appeal to, in order to say one is correct. So O'Grady presents the main battle in ontology between these two positions: an anti-realist position called the ontological relativist and a realist position called the sophisticated realist. Both in some sense actually accept and have moved on to a Post Kantian type of picture. The sophisticated realist is a realist because they still want to hold on that there is a mind-independent reality or world. But they are actually unlike the naive realist that was probably far more likely to exist in the pre-Kantian picture. A realist that believed there was only one theory, one could say, that we have that is of a mind-independent reality. One theory that is the most correct one, or that other theories can be reduced to just one theory. For example, in the old school, perhaps we may have thought that physics is the ultimate theory. Other stuff, whether psychology or sociology, everything can be reduced to physics. And physics being not merely about the world as we know it, but about a mind-independent reality as well. That's not really a sophisticated realist position. In the post-Kantian picture, however, the sophisticated realist holds that we can actually have different theories of the world, based in part because they give assent to the idea how different conceptual schemes are giving meaning to the worlds, different worlds, so there would be different theories of the world. And yet one of those theories isn't considered the correct one or most correct one, that they can all exist and yet not be reduced to each other. But they are still nevertheless about a mind-independent reality that exists and is a certain way. It has certain properties that I guess they would say either is successfully or not conveyed or somehow connected to those theories. And so somehow or other, structure, or perhaps how Paul O'Grady would phrase it, constraint on what our theories can even be is coming in part from here as well, a mind-independent reality. Not just there, not just the mind. In this sense, the sophisticated realist feels that they have accommodated relativism and how our conceptual schemes construct what we know, but still are realists about reality. This in modern philosophic warfare is the main battle happening in ontology as it is presented by Paul O'Grady. A battle between the ontological relativist and the sophisticated realist. While it may seem like the sophisticated realist is actually pretty accommodating, the ontological relativist, still being an anti-realist, denies the sophisticated realist position, saying there is no sense of the world beyond the mind, that it makes no sense to speak of it having properties or being a certain way. Because of course, in order for something to be discussed as being a certain way, having certain properties, only ever makes sense within a conceptual scheme. It only makes sense if concepts are being applied, and if it is, then we aren't actually talking about a mind-independent reality. Also, it seems to be that part of the ontological relativist's point is to say that if theories can in fact be different and not reducible, and that one theory isn't the most correct one, then what point also is there even mentioning that there is this thing? Why bother bringing that up then? Now, this may seem super frustrating for those of us who are realists, but it's not like we didn't in some sense feel a similar way when it came to big. Remember, talking about this cube as if it is big makes no sense. It can't be called that. That's how we felt. So the ontological relativist may actually be equally frustrated with us in insisting that reality is a certain way and has certain properties as we might be with someone else who doesn't understand why this cube, that has nothing else to be compared to, cannot be described as big, since big is relative. The ontological relativists feel that all properties or description, everything, is relative to a conceptual scheme, which comes from a mind. And yet, here we are trying to describe mind-independent reality with no conceptual scheme applied, yet still trying to say it has certain properties and is a certain way. That equally doesn't seem to have any meaning or have any sense in the way that describing a cube as being big when it's the only thing in existence seems to be meaningless or like an empty idea. Now, as an aside note, there's also another reason that works for them in their perspective. Not only is there this basis of how our conceptual scheme is giving shape or constructing or at least providing the schemata for which things can have meaning in the first place, but they also feel that this in some way helps them defend against skepticism. Because one of the big issues in philosophy is that despite what we claim to know, it's possible that no matter how much justification we have, that a mind-independent reality could nevertheless be different. In more of a classic way of phrasing it, I guess we could say we could hold full justified belief about what the truth is, and yet the truth could still nevertheless be different. Hence, we would not have knowledge. In fact, that possibility is always the case, meaning we could never really know if we actually have knowledge or not, which is pretty skeptical, because a mind-independent reality may always turn out different. Now, Kant thought something like this too, that he had somehow solved this kind of skeptical issue in some way, because when ontology is about this, then the possibility about being wrong of a mind-independent reality isn't really an issue for the anti-realist that drops that concept. But that isn't all that convincing to the realist, who would say dropping this, that we can ever know or understand it, or be in any way, shape, or form in contact with reality, is exactly skepticism. You haven't defeated it, you just given into it. So that isn't much of a motivator for a realist. But the ontological relativists say back, it's only not convincing because you are applying your unjustified view about there being this thing. We didn't lose the world, we didn't lose objects, we didn't lose things, we don't deny reality exists, just that all those terms are about this. No words or terms or identifiers or symbols or anything make sense about anything beyond this. A conceptual scheme or paradigm or language is required for something to even make sense or have meaning. And so I find this is where most of the battle really is, about the frustration of trying to use terms that are always nevertheless tied into this area for the ontological relativists. But I'll kind of show you what I mean. First, it's important to note here that for the ontological relativist, in this sense, there is no division between epistemology, the study of knowledge, and ontology then. Because the ontological relativist denies the division between mind and world. There is no world beyond the mind. And accusing the ontological relativist of simply conflating the issues of what we can know and understand with issues about what exists, well, the ontological relativist points out that that conflation only makes sense because you had already presumed an ontological perspective with a mind-world distinction in the first place. Some realists would argue, well, we have a realist conception first, and that thereafter we actually need good reasons to be able to switch to another ontology, and that there are no good reasons for that. But are we really ontological realists first? I mean, common day people aren't exactly philosophers, and also just the idea that it's first would eventually mean anything, as O'Grady says, that doesn't actually cut much ice for philosophers. I never actually heard that expression before, but I think it's super dope. Oh, it doesn't cut much ice for philosophers. Like, you know, I don't know. Do philosophers cut ice? I don't know what O'Grady's doing on his part-time. Anyway, okay, so one of the main issues here that I'm going to describe is a big philosophic trouble actually. So please think of it yourself and really try to grasp what the ontological relativist is saying here. Because there's actually problems for both sides. Because a problem for the sophisticated realist is what exactly is coming from here. I mean, we want to say that the world is a certain way, right? It has to be or have, and this is my phrasing to help explain it in the way I think of it, but it has to have some kind of information then. But the relativist for good reason says information cannot exist without a language for it to be expressed within. And even the realist wants to recognize this. They want to be able to recognize that without a conceptual scheme to have any meaning in, there can't be information. So it kind of seems impossible to be able to say or describe what is out here that has any information, or properties, or is a certain way. just simply impossible to convey what it's influencing here, what structure or what constraints it gives to what our theories can be. How can we express this inexpressible? How can we talk about information being in the world when there's no language out there? Language comes from us, our minds. But on the other hand, the problem for the ontological relativist is that they don't really want to say that everything is coming from our mind. That would be a kind of radical idealistic picture that they deny. That the world is just ideas, that we can just literally flippantly change reality with different concepts that we make up as we go along. O'Grady calls this Promethean anti-realism. But it's important to point out that reality there is meant in their sense, this middle thing. Reality, the world, stuff, information, things, objects, matter, properties. And all of those only have meaning constrained within the conceptual scheme. And so this conversation is really hard because anytime a realist tries to use these words to describe what they're talking about, they can be pulled into the terms as used by the ontological relativist. And that's super frustrating. But as it seems to me at least, they too, in their own terms, are inconsistent. Even in this chapter, as O'Grady is describing their position, they are inconsistent. Part of this inconsistency, which I would argue, and I think clearly is the more damning part, is the fact that in order to explain their position, in order to deny that these words are about this thing and are instead about this thing, to even make that clarification, they are in the process of speaking about this thing, which they say is meaningless or impossible to do. This kind of relates to the lesson Wittgenstein gives in On Certainty, where it's nonsense to respond to nonsense, and yet here they sometimes talk about the realist position in order to contrast against it in a meaningful way. Again, in the process of denying an unconceptualized reality, they employ that concept as if non-relative and as if meaningful. For if it could only actually even possibly be meant in a relative way, which is what they are fine with, then they would not be in a process of denying it. In their process of pulling terms into their relative stance, they sometimes use the terms in a non-relative way to explain or elucidate the change or meaningful difference. So it seems it is possible then for those words to mean something other than what the relativists insist that they can only possibly mean. So this move of mine here for this chapter, I'm not really visualizing too much right now because in part we've already seen it before in other applications for truth. So I hope you kind of still understand what the point is I'm making here. But also it will certainly be given much more detailing in the chapter on rationality because it will be used by Paul O'Grady, and I promise that detailing will be wonderful. Anyway, there is another reason for their occasional inconsistency here. In order to deny just being full-blown idealist, they do seem to want to brute force say that it just exists. And don't get me wrong, they are consistent that we can't talk about what this stuff is like, that it has any properties or information, but at most that it just is. Hence the cosmic porridge or the visual of gray mush that I used. But at the same time, and here's a problem that was even for Kant, it exists is a property. To say something exists is also to talk about it, and they actually do seem to need to employ it as if other than the mind because they don't want to say the world is just the mind. But at the same time, the world isn't beyond the mind. So you can see it seems to lead them in a kind of confused state. It definitely isn't the state that they want to say that something is beyond the mind. They want to say the world is within the mind. And yet they don't want to say that we are actually constructing everything from our own heads. Or at least deny that it's possible that we could somehow just flippantly decide or on a whim decide what concepts we want to use and change reality as it is actually experienced by us. So because they don't want to say there can be any infinite random tandem amount of theories, they want to apply some restrictions to it, but deny that the restrictions to what the theories can be come from a mind-independent reality. Instead, they proclaim that the constraints on what theories can exist about the world come from the mind itself. But that means this restraint, which comes from the mind, could nevertheless be the means by which we criticize another if that is itself universal in some way. And what are those constraints? Well, Paul O'Grady is going to give an account of what those restrictions are in his chapter 5 in Rationality. Now, from here on in O'Grady's chapter in Ontology, he does have a kind of outline that mainly focuses on two philosophers that are most well known for ontological relativism, both Quine and Putnam. And really he does go to some detail explaining their positions because it's not exactly a simple thing to talk about. But I'm just gonna skip all of it completely. After explaining both of their positions, he then has 7 objections to ontological relativism. 3 of those objections are specifically targeted to Putnam, 1 objection is specifically targeted to Quine, and the final 3 are just general arguments against ontological relativism. Some of these arguments work but seem to target just the philosopher and not the kind of general position of ontological relativism. Other arguments just seem to lead to other battlefields, like whether or not IBE, inference to the best explanation, is appropriate to making ontological metaphysical arguments about the nature of reality. This is namely the no miracles argument, and like I said, I don't want to get into all of this stuff. Ultimately, when it comes to these arguments, it simply seems that there isn't a kind of final blow. There isn't anything fully restricting the possibility of ontological relativism. So O'Grady allows for ontological relativism here. He seems to settle on the idea that relativism does go all the way through to the end, and anything beyond that is meaningless to talk about. And so in some sense he also, perhaps on that basis, I'm a little bit unsure, but he does accept the kind of differentiation between truth and ontology. He feels one can absolutely be an absolutist, that is a non-relativist about truth, while still being a relativist about ontology. And certainly that seems to work within the schema of the ontological relativist, since the ontological relativist is denying a mind-independent reality. So all you would have to do is discuss capital T truth as if it doesn't have to do with a mind-independent reality. And indeed, if you do go look back on that chapter where he does absolutely defend a non-relativist truth, he isn't relying on appeals to a mind-independent reality, which is actually pretty great. But anyway, here in this chapter is actually where I'm kind of really critical of O'Grady. Well, maybe not really critical, but kind of critical. And in my final video about this book, I will take a closer look at this chapter to outline the kind of criticism that I have. But to me, and I'm just a shadowy character on the internet here, still he seems to be tricked by a technique used by the relativists, and maybe not exactly tricked, cause that technique is used in other areas and he combats against that same technique. So instead I currently feel like even though he could have actually made a stronger case against the relativist in ontology, he really is instead merely allowing for relativism in ontology to a much greater extent, both because he feels it's safer than in epistemology where it can cause damage to rationality, since rationality actually plays a role in epistemology, but also because he feels he can agree to segregating the areas of truth from ontology, saving his victory there. Not only is it safest to allow it here, I think in part his technique in this book overall is simply to funnel the relativist away from other areas to this place where they can cause the least amount of damage to the areas he battles against it. In any case, there are still some good battles in this chapter, and he does give much more detail in the dealings with 3 philosophers in particular, Devitt, Quine, and Putnam. If you, my subscribers, really would like a detailed look at this chapter, perhaps I will do it at some point in time. But you gotta let me know, because these videos, they're super hard to make all by myself. I have no editors, no animators, no co-writers, and no funding beyond my one Patreon supporter, Slickpockets, as yet. And like I said, I didn't really come here to the battlefield of metaphysics for this, even though, yeah, this is probably the most metaphysical stuff that I'm talking about even in this whole series. In either case, this issue as I see it, and we will see it again, is a problem in different areas and can be described and visualized in many ways, and this is just one way. The question and issue is, how is information outside, if language can't be? How is that outside influencing the inside? What of our descriptions of the world? What amount, what way, and what properties is from outside? How can we ever know since we cannot know the outside? I can go on and on for hours rephrasing that. So instead, I would try to ask you to phrase the problem yourself in your own mind to get a good grip with what the problem really is. Because you really do come to grip with the philosophic problem when you realize, due to this new post-Kantian picture, simply saying we get the outside inside by observing, seeing, touching, etc. no longer is sufficient, as even those acts, what we are seeing, what information we are getting when we touch, it is structured by the kind of creatures we are, the kind of interests we have, the kind of minds we have, the influence of the kind of conceptual scheme we have built for ourselves, influenced by our histories, like if we are in the medieval ages or after Einstein, and many other things. So I do have my own opinion and my own kind of answer in some sense about some of these things, but it's not my place to say it here. As I said, I will talk about ontology again after I am done and giving an evaluation of this book. But I simply do not think I have any right here, at least in this place, to start telling you what I think the proper solution is in my kind of formal idea and presentation of it. I'm not trying to do that. I was just trying to give you an outlay of what's going on in ontological relativism, the kind of issues that are at play, and the kind of position that Paul O'Grady settles on. Now let's move on to that next area, epistemological relativism. See you there for the battle. Oh, please subscribe and stuff, that would be like super nice, because I really want to be able to prove that a philosopher can exist out here on the internet and it can provide a place for us. Anyway,